You know the exact cost of being the reliable one. The sensible eldest sister who simply takes up too much room when the younger ones are ready to shine. When the Whitmore family realized 26-year-old Eleanor complicated their social ambitions and her hidden trust settlement threatened their finances, they did what practical, ruthless families do. They packed her away. They exiled her to a crumbling tenant cottage on a freezing northern moor, assuming she would quietly fade. But they made one crucial miscalculation. They forgot exactly who owned the north and what the terrible Duke of Ashworth did to trespassers. The trunk was half the size of her younger sister's hatbox, which seemed fitting to Eleanor Whitmore. At 26, she had long ago learned to occupy as little space as possible in the London townhouse. Downstairs, the hallway hummed with the frantic, expensive energy of her sister's first social season, a whirlwind of calling cards and silk merchants. Upstairs, Eleanor folded her plain, dark wool dresses in absolute silence. Her stepmother Felicity had made the decree just 2 days prior, her tone clipped and final over a hastily poured cup of morning tea. Eleanor was simply too old, too plain, and entirely in the way of a successful match for the family's true hope. The proposed solution was a sudden, enforced exile to the bitter edge of Yorkshire. Felicity claimed an old Whitmore connection had left them the prolonged use of a tenant cottage on a vast northern estate. Yet the sheer speed of the arrangement felt less like a generous holiday and entirely like an eviction. Eleanor was observant, even if no one observed her. She had noticed the panicked whispers between her father and stepmother whenever the post arrived, and the frantic shuffling of locked ledgers in the study. They needed her gone before her 27th birthday next month. She did not know why that specific date mattered so deeply to them, only that her continued presence in London had suddenly become a dangerous inconvenience they could no longer afford. Before closing the battered leather lid of her trunk, Eleanor touched the small velvet box sitting on her narrow bed. Inside rested a simple cameo brooch carved with a delicate, faded profile. It had belonged to her mother. Felicity had laughed at it years ago, dismissing the piece as hopelessly unfashionable and cheap, refusing to let the younger girls anywhere near it. That cruel dismissal was the exact reason Eleanor had been allowed to keep it. She pinned the brooch to the collar of her heavy travel cloak, using it as a quiet anchor to the woman she barely remembered, and locked the trunk. She walked out the front door without a single farewell from the crowded drawing room downstairs. The bruising journey north stripped away the noise and smog of the city, replacing it with a sprawling, unforgiving cold that seeped through the carriage walls. When the hired driver finally abandoned her at the edge of a frozen moor, the reality of her exile settled deep into her bones. The promised cottage was a grim, isolated structure of dark stone, its slate roof sagging under the heavy weight of winter. Inside, the air was deeply damp, the hearthstone cold, and the solitary local girl hired to light the fires looked at Eleanor with blatant, unfiltered suspicion. A respectable single woman did not simply appear on an empty estate without a chaperone or a husband, and the servants' narrowed eyes promised the gossip would travel fast through the village. Eleanor wrapped her cloak tighter against the draft and walked to the small, distorted glass of the front window. The moors stretched out in a violent sea of gray and bruised purple, entirely empty except for one impossible structure dominating the distance: Ashworth Hall. It sat against the jagged horizon like a fortress, its massive stone walls dark and watchful against the failing winter light. It was the ancestral seat of the Duke of Ashworth, a man local whispers already claimed was as harsh and unforgiving as the frozen land he owned. Felicity had smoothly assured her father the cottage was safely theirs to use, an overlooked remnant of an old, dusty lease that no one would question. But looking at the rigid, terrifying precision of the Duke's estate from her freezing window, Eleanor felt a sudden sharp knot of dread pull tight in her chest. This was not a landscape where things were simply forgotten or overlooked. She was entirely alone, legally unprotected, and standing on land ruled by a man who notoriously despised intruders. As the first winter wind rattled the thin glass panes, she had the sinking, terrible suspicion Her family had sent her to trespass. Thomas, the Duke of Ashworth, did not tolerate surprises on his land. When his estate manager stood in the cavernous library of Ashworth Hall and reported a carriage had arrived at the abandoned Oakhaven cottage, Thomas assumed it was a mistake. The lease held by the Whitmore family had legally dissolved a decade ago. Thomas stood by the roaring fire, his dark expression hardening. He had spent the last 5 years brutally stripping away the parasites and false friends who had nearly ruined the estate before his father's death. He ordered the manager to draft an immediate eviction notice, intending to have the trespassers removed by noon. But when the man added that the carriage had deposited a single, unaccompanied young woman before fleeing back south, Thomas paused. A lone woman residing on his land without a chaperone was not just a legal nuisance, it was a severe social liability. The local villages were deeply isolated, and gossip was the only currency that never lost value here. By tomorrow, the servants would whisper that the reclusive duke had installed a mistress in the ruined cottage. By the end of the week, the rumor would inevitably reach London. It was a calculated risk that no respectable family would force upon a daughter unless they wanted her utterly ruined. Thomas stared out the massive window at the darkening moors, the tension rising in his jaw. Whoever this Whitmore woman was, her family had not sent her here for a holiday. They had thrown her to the wolves. He did not send the eviction notice. Instead, Thomas rode out onto the freezing moor just after dawn, the biting wind tearing at his heavy riding coat. He stopped his massive black gelding on the ridge above Oakhaven Cottage, keeping himself concealed against the tree line. The house was a miserable shell, entirely unfit for winter habitation. Half the roof slates were missing, and the stone mortar was crumbling to dust. Yet through the thin morning mist, he saw the back door open. It was not a weeping, panicked debutante who stepped into the freezing dirt yard. It was a woman, in a plain, sensible dark cloak, a faded cameo brooch pinned to her collar, catching the pale light. She carried a heavy tin bucket. She moved with quiet, uncomplaining efficiency, breaking the thin ice over the iron pump handle to draw her own water. Thomas watched her haul the heavy bucket back inside, her spine straight despite the brutal cold. His chest tightened with an unexpected sharp strike of respect. She was completely abandoned. The chimney produced only a pathetic, struggling line of gray smoke, meaning she had no proper dry wood to fight the bitter northern draft. Thomas pulled his horse around, his mind rapidly shifting from legal irritation to a quiet, dangerous anger. He understood the brutal mechanics of cruel families perfectly well, as he bore the deep scars of his own father's betrayals. When he returned to the estate office at Ashworth Hall, he bypassed the stack of legal papers entirely. He ordered his manager to send a cart of seasoned firewood, heavy winter provisions, and thick woolen blankets down to Oakhaven before nightfall. When the manager hesitated, asking what name should be given for the charity, Thomas met his eye with a chilling, absolute stillness. He instructed the man to say they were standard estate provisions for all winter tenants, refusing to let her feel like a beggar. Thomas returned to his library, but the vast, silent room offered no comfort. He sat behind his heavy mahogany desk and pulled the estate ledger toward him, tracing the old, ink-stained lines of the Whitmore lease. The numbers simply did not make sense. The family had stopped paying rent years ago, yet they had suddenly shipped a daughter to the property in the dead of winter. It felt like a trap, but not one meant for him. It was a trap meant to erase her. Thomas closed the heavy ledger, the image of the woman hauling her own water burning clearly in his mind. He was a man who hated involvement, but he could not simply watch a woman freeze to death on his own land. He would have to meet her. The heavy knock on the cottage door came just as the afternoon light began to fail. Eleanor froze, the heavy iron poker still in her hand from tending the unexpected life-saving fire. Visitors on the desolate moor were impossible, and an unchaperoned woman receiving callers was a social death sentence. She opened the door just enough to see a massive black carriage waiting in the freezing mud. Standing on her crumbling stone step was a man who seemed carved from the same unforgiving landscape. He was tall, his dark coat sweeping around his boots, and his eyes held a severe, assessing intelligence that immediately made her lungs tight. He did not ask for permission to enter, and he did not hand her a calling card. He simply looked down at her and introduced himself as Thomas, the Duke of Ashworth, and the legal owner of the ground she was standing on. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the cold wind whipped between them. She braced herself for an immediate eviction, but his tone was steady and completely devoid of the mocking cruelty she was used to in London. He bluntly informed her that the Whitmore lease had expired a decade ago. Her family had no legal right to the cottage, and sending an unmarried woman alone to a ruined property was not an oversight. It was a deliberate, calculated abandonment. The words struck her like a physical blow, shattering the fragile lie she had told herself. Her father had not simply pushed her aside for the season. He had knowingly abandoned her to trespass on a ruthless man's land, hoping the resulting scandal or the brutal winter would swallow her whole. She did not cry, and she did not collapse. Eleanor tightened her grip on the doorframe and met the Duke's intense gaze. She asked him quietly why he had sent the firewood if she was entirely unwelcome. A faint, surprising flicker of respect crossed his dark eyes. Instead of ordering her into the snow, Thomas stepped back from the threshold, meticulously observing the strict boundaries of propriety to protect her reputation from his own servants. He told her there were discrepancies in the old estate ledgers regarding her family's financial history, and he required her assistance to translate them. It was a thinly veiled excuse to offer her shelter without treating her like a beggar, and Eleanor recognized the quiet dignity in his offer. Half an hour later, wrapped in her plain cloak, she rode beside his stern, silent housekeeper up the winding drive to Ashworth Hall. The estate library was a sprawling, magnificent fortress of leather and mahogany, smelling of sharp wood smoke and old paper. Thomas directed her to a heavy oak table where an enormous ledger lay open under the golden light of a brass lamp. He did not treat her like a fragile, simple-minded girl, but spoke to her as an equal, pointing out the missing rent payments and the strange, sudden legal inquiries her father had made last autumn. As Eleanor leaned over the pages, her mother's faded cameo brooch swung slightly from her collar. Thomas stopped speaking mid-sentence, his gaze locked onto the simple carved profile, his expression tightening into a sudden, dangerous focus. He walked to a locked iron cabinet in the corner and withdrew a separate, dust-covered file wrapped in a faded legal ribbon. He placed a heavy parchment document in front of her, his voice low and carefully controlled. It was a copy of a trust settlement from her mother's family, explicitly naming Eleanor as the sole beneficiary of a massive independent fortune. The terms were brutally clear. The money was locked in a blind trust until her 27th birthday, and until that exact date, her father retained full control over the interest. The date of maturity was only 3 weeks away. The air in the library suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The cruel, devastating truth locked perfectly into place, turning her quiet exile into a violent crime. Felicity and her father had never hated her plain face or her quiet manners. They had hated her survival. They needed her exiled, ruined, or entirely broken before she could legally claim the money that was funding her sister's lavish London season. Eleanor looked up from the damning ink, her hands trembling, not from the cold, but from a profound, world-shattering grief. She was entirely alone, trapped in the north, with the only man standing between her and total ruin, watching her with a fierce, unwavering protection. The heavy, aggressively perfumed envelope practically offended the sharp wood-smoke-scented air of the Duke's library. Thomas broke the thick wax seal with his thumb, his jaw tight. The letter from London was a masterclass in polite poison. Felicity Whitmore wrote with the cloying, frantic tone of a distressed mother, painting a deeply tragic picture of her stepdaughter. According to the elegant looping script, Eleanor was emotionally unstable, prone to unseemly delusions, and tragically obsessed with attaching herself to men of high station to escape her own plainness. Felicity begged His Grace's profound forgiveness for Eleanor's scandalous trespass on the northern estate, assuring him that she and her husband were already securing a train to retrieve the poor, confused girl before she could compromise Ashworth Hall any further. Thomas tossed the letter onto his mahogany desk as if it were diseased. It was a perfectly executed social trap. Felicity was weaponizing the strict, unforgiving rules of Victorian propriety against him. A single, unchaperoned woman residing on a bachelor duke's land was already a smoldering fire. This letter was the kerosene. If Thomas kept Eleanor here, Felicity would spread the narrative that the fearsome Duke of Ashworth was taking advantage of a disturbed spinster. Any other aristocrat terrified of the relentless destructive power of drawing-room gossip would have immediately ordered the girl onto a southbound train and washed his hands of the entire filthy affair. Felicity was entirely counting on his pride and his famous desire for isolation. She expected him to do the brutal work of discarding Eleanor for her. But Felicity Whitmore had never seen her stepdaughter break the morning ice over a rusted pump handle without a single complaint. She had not spent the last 3 evenings sitting across from Eleanor in the quiet warmth of the library, discovering a woman of quiet brilliance, fierce resilience, and devastating grace. Thomas walked over to the heavy oak table where the mother's trust settlement remained spread open. Resting directly beside the faded legal seal was the simple cameo brooch Eleanor had accidentally left behind the previous night, her hands too numb with shock to pin it back to her cloak. Thomas picked up the brooch. The carved profile perfectly matched the ancestral crest stamped into the trust's wax seal. It was absolute, undeniable proof of her lineage, and her worth. The exact worth her family was desperately trying to suffocate. He held the small, inexpensive piece of jewelry in his large hand, feeling a strange, profound ache in his chest. His entire life had been defined by a ruthless need to protect himself from the greed and manipulation of the world. He had built Ashworth Hall into an impenetrable fortress, vowing never to care for someone who could be used as leverage against him. To step between Eleanor and her family was to invite chaos, scandal, and legal warfare directly into his sanctuary. It meant exposing himself. It meant vulnerability. He looked toward the heavy double doors of the library, knowing Eleanor was currently resting in a guest chamber down the hall, under the strict, watchful care of his housekeeper. The thought of Felicity's carriage arriving to drag her back to the suffocating dark of that London townhouse made a violent protective rage flare in his blood. He refused to let her be erased. Thomas sat down at his desk, pulling a sheet of heavy crested parchment toward him. He dipped his pen and drafted a devastatingly brief, coldly polite reply to London. He informed Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore that their daughter was currently an honored, chaperoned guest of Ashworth Hall, and that his own personal solicitors were eagerly anticipating their arrival to discuss the immediate, legally mandated transfer of her maternal trust. He signed his name with sharp, unyielding strokes. The irreversible line was crossed. The isolation he had guarded for years was gone, replaced by a fierce, undeniable devotion. They were coming for her, but they would have to break him to get her. The heavy rumble of carriage wheels on the gravel drive sent a violent shock of cold through Eleanor's chest. She stood near the massive fireplace in the formal drawing room of Ashworth Hall, her hands clasped tightly together to hide their tremor. The past 3 days under the Duke's roof had felt like breathing pure air for the first time in her life, but the arrival of the London carriage brought the suffocating smog right back. When the heavy double doors opened, Felicity Whitmore swept into the room, wrapped in expensive furs and wielding a terrifying, perfectly polished maternal concern. Eleanor's father followed a step behind, his eyes fixed firmly on the intricate pattern of the carpet, refusing to look at his eldest daughter. Thomas stood near the tall windows, a silent, imposing shadow against the gray afternoon light. He had promised not to intervene unless Eleanor asked, honoring her need to face the people who had tried to erase her. Felicity immediately took control of the tea service, a deliberate, aggressive maneuver to assert her dominance over the situation. She poured a cup and held it out to Eleanor with a tight, brittle smile, her voice echoing too loudly in the cavernous room. She declared it an absolute tragedy that Eleanor had wandered off to the ruined cottage in such a confused state of mind, assuring the Duke that the poor girl had simply misunderstood her instructions and succumbed to her usual nervous melancholy. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that Eleanor felt a familiar, paralyzing weight press down on her throat. For 26 years, she had swallowed these quiet humiliations, accepting her role as the family's fragile, inconvenient burden. She looked at her father, waiting for a single word of defense, but he simply stirred his tea, his silence a profound and cowardly betrayal. Felicity set her cup down with a sharp porcelain clink, and smoothly announced that the carriage was waiting to take Eleanor safely back to London, where she could be properly confined and cared for. It was a flawless execution of social warfare. If Eleanor refused, she would prove herself unstable and hysterical, validating every venomous word Felicity had written. Eleanor looked down at her plain wool dress and then up at the dark, unwavering gaze of the Duke of Ashworth. He did not rush forward to save her. He simply watched her with absolute, steady respect, waiting for her to realize she did not need rescuing. The air in the room shifted. Eleanor did not take the offered cup of tea. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step forward, her voice remarkably clear and completely devoid of panic. She looked directly at her stepmother and asked how the London season was being funded. The polite, suffocating mask on Felicity's face slipped for a fraction of a second. Eleanor did not stop. She kept her tone civil, weaponizing the very etiquette Felicity relied upon, and calmly laid out the exact details of her mother's blind trust. She mentioned the specific date of her upcoming 27th birthday, the massive accumulated interest, and the sudden frantic need to have her removed from the city before the solicitors required her physical signature. Every word was precise, steady, and devastating. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy with ruin. Felicity's face flushed a deep, ugly red, her hands trembling as the fragile illusion of her respectability shattered. Eleanor finally looked at her father. She asked him quietly if he had truly hated her mother so much that he was willing to let her only daughter freeze on a northern moor to steal what was rightfully hers. He flinched, as if struck, his face crumbling into a pathetic, undeniable guilt. The truth was fully exposed in the harsh winter light, and the cost settled heavily into Eleanor's bones. She had her answer, and she had her freedom. But the profound pain of knowing her own father had actively plotted her destruction left a cold, hollow ache in her chest. She had survived the trap, but the family she had known was permanently broken. The silence in the drawing room shattered the moment Felicity comprehended the absolute totality of her defeat. But the older woman was a creature of ruthless, terrifying survival. Instead of retreating into shame, Felicity rapidly changed tactics, her harsh features violently contorting into a mask of desperate, weaponized pity. She rushed forward, her expensive furs rustling loudly in the quiet room, and reached out to grasp Eleanor's hands with a cloying, sudden affection. The stepmother spoke frantically of Christian forgiveness, family duty, and the absolute ruinous scandal that would instantly destroy her younger sister's marriage prospects if Eleanor chose to abandon them now. She pleaded for Eleanor to simply return to London in the waiting carriage, promising the Cheapside townhouse would be completely hers to command, assuring her that the trust money would remain entirely untouched, provided they maintained a united, respectable front for the brutal society gossips. It was a masterful twisting manipulation, deliberately using Eleanor's deeply ingrained decency to drag her right back into the suffocating cage they had just tried to lock her out of. For a terrifying, agonizing moment, the old, crushing weight of obligation pressed heavily down upon Eleanor's shoulders. The lifelong instinct to smooth over the conflict, to absorb the pain, and be the reliable, invisible anchor for her family's comfort was a devastatingly difficult habit to break. She looked past Felicity's grasping hands to her father, who was now weeping quietly into his embroidered handkerchief. A thoroughly broken man, silently begging his discarded daughter to shield him from his own wife's vicious schemes. She could easily go back. She could claim her mother's money, return to the city, and rule the very house that had once suffocated her, forcing them into a miserable, silent submission born of financial terror. The power dynamic had violently reversed, and the intoxicating, dangerous lure of simple revenge flashed brightly in her mind. But as the suffocating pressure mounted, Eleanor turned her gaze away from her family and looked toward the heavy mahogany table where her mother's simple cameo brooch rested directly beside the legal settlement. The Duke of Ashworth had placed it there earlier, a quiet, unshakable testament to the undeniable truth of her worth. Thomas remained standing by the tall windows, his large frame perfectly still against the fading winter light, watching her with a quiet, burning intensity. He was heavily armed with legal power and social standing, but he deliberately kept his silence. He was not going to step forward and command her to stay, nor would he fight this final battle on her behalf. He was offering her the one profound thing she had never possessed in her entire 26 years, the absolute, unrestricted power to choose her own fate. Eleanor gently but firmly pulled her hands free from Felicity's frantic, grasping fingers. The physical separation felt like breaking a heavy iron chain. She walked purposefully to the table, her plain, dark wool dress a stark contrast to the luxurious, trembling panic she left behind her. She picked up the small cameo brooch, the smooth, worn edge of the carved profile, grounding her entirely in the present, completely stripping away the lingering, fearful ghosts of her childhood obedience. She pinned the brooch securely to her collar, not as a forgotten relic, but as a visible badge of her reclaimed identity. When she finally turned back to face them, her voice was remarkably steady, the clear, ringing words echoing with absolute finality across the cavernous room. She coldly informed her father that she would be retaining the Duke of Ashworth's personal solicitors to oversee the immediate, aggressive transfer of the trust into her own name. She would absolutely not be returning to London, nor would she spend a single penny of her mother's inheritance to fund the shallow social season they had actively tried to kill her for. She instructed them to return to their waiting carriage immediately and head south to manage their own ruin. Felicity let out a sharp, ugly gasp of genuine terror, while her father finally looked up, his pale face crumbling with the devastating realization that his eldest daughter was completely, irrevocably gone. The decisive cut was made, and as Eleanor turned her back on the furious, weeping remnants of her former life, an incredible, weightless relief finally flooded her lungs. Thomas watched from the high library window as the heavy London carriage disappeared into the bitter northern dusk, its lanterns swallowed entirely by the rising mist. The massive oak door of the drawing room had closed behind the Whitmores, leaving a profound, ringing silence in the great hall. He turned away from the glass to look at Eleanor. She had not collapsed, and she had not wept, but she stood rigidly by the roaring fireplace, her shoulders holding the devastating weight of a woman who had just severed her own roots. Thomas knew that specific, agonizing hollow in the chest intimately. He had spent years building a vast fortress of stone and silence to survive his own family's treachery, but he had just watched her dismantle hers in a matter of minutes with nothing but the brutal truth. He walked slowly across the heavy carpet, acutely aware that the explosive tension in the room had suddenly shifted from legal warfare to something far more personal and dangerous. The strict boundaries of their protective alliance were entirely gone. There were no more ledgers to translate, no more fraudulent leases to hide behind, and no furious stepmother to defend her against. There was only the quiet, terrifying reality of a massive, empty house and the undeniable, heavy gravitational pull between them. As he stepped into the warm glow of the hearth, he saw her mother's faded cameo brooch resting securely at her collar. It was no longer a hidden relic of a dead woman, but the absolute foundation of a fiercely living one. Thomas stopped a respectable distance away, keeping his hands loosely clasped behind his back, refusing to crowd her in the moment of her rawest vulnerability. He spoke quietly, his deep voice carrying easily in the silent room. He told her she was now an incredibly wealthy, completely independent woman. With the trust fully executed in her name, she could purchase a fine estate in a warmer county, hire a legion of loyal servants, and live precisely as she wished, without ever answering to another living soul. He needed to ensure she understood the absolute scope of her victory. He was not going to insult her fierce, hard-won independence by offering her a rescue she clearly did not require. Eleanor finally looked up from the fire, her dark eyes meeting his with a steady, exhausted clarity. She did not offer a polite deflection or a nervous retreat. Instead, she asked him bluntly what he actually wanted her to do. The simple directness of the question stripped away the very last of Thomas's carefully guarded defenses. the legendary isolation he had fiercely protected for 5 years, suddenly felt incredibly cold and useless. He took a slow step forward, completely abandoning the safe distance of drawing room propriety. He confessed that he wanted her to stay. He admitted with a quiet, uncomfortable honesty that he had built Ashworth Hall to keep the dangerous, greedy world out, but she was the only person he had ever wanted to let in. He explicitly told her he was not asking for a dependent, a guest, or a quiet ornament for his table. He was asking for an equal partner to help him run the vast, unforgiving estate they both understood. The heavy, unspoken barrier that had hung between them for days finally collapsed. Eleanor did not step away from him. Instead, she reached up and lightly touched the carved edge of the cameo brooch. A small grounding gesture before looking out the tall window toward the darkening frozen moors. She quietly pointed out that the ruined cottage at Oakhaven still needed a proper slate roof, and the estate ledgers in his library were still a miserable, disorganized disaster. A rare, genuine smile broke the severe lines of Thomas's face, easing the harshness he usually presented to the world. He closed the final distance between them and gently took her cold hand in his. The deep, agonizing bruise of her family's betrayal would undoubtedly ache whenever the winter wind blew. But as Thomas felt the strong, steady pulse at her wrist, he knew they had finally secured the one thing neither of them had ever expected. They had built a fortress together, and neither of them would ever be exiled again. There is always a profound cost to being the sensible eldest sister. Society dictates that you step aside, quietly surrendering your inheritance and your voice so others might shine in the London season. But when you are exiled to the freezing edges of the world, you might just find the one person who refuses to let you disappear. Under Victorian law, a woman's wealth was rarely her own until she either married or fought a brutal legal battle to claim her independence. Eleanor fought that battle, not in a crowded courtroom, but in the quiet library of a man who saw her true worth, long before he ever saw the documents that proved it. The simple cameo brooch that once marked her as an unwanted burden now rests safely in Ashworth Hall, a quiet testament to a woman who finally chose herself. When was the last time you stopped carrying everyone else's weight and asked what you actually wanted? Subscribe and join us next time, where another forgotten woman finds exactly what she deserves.